Everyone tells you that walnut is the holy grail of woodworking, oak lasts forever, and maple is bomb-proof. But here's the truth. Some of these most loved woods in the world can also be some of the most disappointing. In fact, some of them might actually be the worst choice for your next project. Too soft, too brittle, or just plain overpriced. And so in this video, I want to talk you through which of these timbers actually deserve the hype and which ones could potentially ruin your next project. So I'm wanting this video to be quite pragmatic as it relates to talking about these woods. I don't want to be diving too deep into the data of things that don't actually mean much to you as a woodworker. However, some of the data points are unavoidable, and so we're going to be focusing on 4 attributes of each of these woods that will help define and explain some of their best uses and some of the areas in which they may fall short of. Those 4 things are janker hardness, modulus of elasticity, modulus of rupture, and compression. I think that's it, can't remember. There's 4 of them. I'll explain these in detail throughout the video because it's a bit easier to explain within the context of certain woods, such as this one. But in a nutshell, janker hardness relates to how easily a wood dents. Modulus of elasticity relates to how bendy the wood is. Modulus of rupture is how much pressure the wood can take before it snaps. And compression strength is actually just how much it can compress end to end. And there's certain uses within woodworking where each of those are of importance and other ones where you don't really need to consider them at all. So with all that said, let's get stuck into the first wood, the old trusty walnut. So walnut needs no introduction because, quite frankly, all of us YouTube woodworkers won't shut the f up about it. It's used so much because of its deep, rich brown tones as well as the nice purple undertones it gives. It's really nice to work with, both in terms of planing, chiseling, sawing, because it's pretty consistent throughout. And yeah, it's just an all-round lovely wood. But it is used a lot, and it's also very expensive. And actually a lot of the reason for this video was to direct us collectively as woodworkers away from this wood, just for a little bit, please. There's so many other better options. Anyway, one interesting thing about a lot of the walnut that you see on YouTube is that it's American black walnut. There's another type, which is just as nice, called English walnut. I'm not really biased in that, to be honest. American black walnut is nicer in many ways because a lot of the time it's grown in plantations, it's made, or I should say it's grown to be used for woodworking. Whereas a lot of the English walnut trees are usually from wild growth and they're not as straight grained. They tend to have a lot of defects and things in them. They're all twisted and they can be difficult to work with, but it is a lovely wood when it's finished. And instead of the kind of purple undertones that are known for with American black, English walnut tends to give you those more earthier brown tones with a little bit of green in it, and I really like it as an alternative to American black every now and then. One interesting fact about walnut that a lot of people don't know is that it can be ebonized using a steel wool and vinegar solution in much the same way that oak can. Oak is renowned for being able to be ebonized, and if you're not sure what that is, I did a video on it last year where I was making a dining table with an oak underframe and I wanted that oak to be black, so I ebonized it. It's really fun, sort of turns it this bluey black color. Walnut is not quite as drastic because there's not as many tannins in it as far as I know, but it can still be ebonized. And in fact, what used to be done, and is probably still done, is where you've got a sapwood line up the edge like this, if you wanted to rid of that sapwood and make it kind of blend in with the heartwood, people would sometimes ebonize just the sapwood alone to blend it all in together. So that can be done, but I'm not going to dig into walnut too much more than that because it is what it is. Everyone should use it at least once, but don't try and use it for every project because it just becomes a bit boring, and there's many other alternatives. Like, for example, if you want something that's still got those warm undertones but slightly less expensive, cherry can be a really good option for you. This specifically is black cherry, which is probably the most commonly used cherry out there. It's basically American cherry. It's quite commonly used for fine furniture and joinery, and in fact around the time of shaker style furniture, cherry was used quite a lot. And interestingly, it will actually darken with age. Now when I work with cherry, I actually find it to be quite hard, but interestingly, when I was comparing the data with American black walnut, which we're using as the standard, apparently the janker hardness on American black walnut is harder than cherry. I'm not quite sure why I personally have always perceived cherry to be harder. I always think that walnut's quite soft, but maybe that's due to the relatively consistent grain that you get from cherry, whereas walnut can be quite open and porous sometimes. So perhaps that's where I'm picking up on it from. Let's just dig in on janker hardness real quick, because I just mentioned it there without giving any context on what it actually is. Janker hardness relates to how much pressure it takes to bury half of this ball bearing into a piece of wood. And the measurement given to this is usually in pounds of force, i.e. how many pounds of force does it take to push this halfway into a piece of wood. So for something like walnut, it takes around about 1,000 pounds of force to bury that ball bearing halfway into it. Whereas cherry, it takes somewhere, what was it? Around about 950, so slightly less. But I wouldn't really get hung up on that difference. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to class that as an average hardness. And in fact, all of the woods from here on, whether it relates to the hardness, the elasticity, the modulus of rupture, or the compression, I'm just going to give it a rating of weak, average, or strong. But that rating, I should stress, is only related in the context of the woods I'm showing today. For example, later on when we talk about maple, I'm going to be classing that as strong in terms of janker hardness, how much it takes to bury this into it. However, that's only about 1,400 pounds of force required to do that. If we expand that to all woods, that's actually pretty weak. I've got some woods back here that take about 4,000 pounds of force to bury that halfway into it. So maple, in the context of all of these, is strong, but in the grand scheme of woods, it's pretty weak, I would say. Anyway, that's janker hardness. Back to cherry. We got two samples here, black cherry, and this is sweet cherry. Cherry, otherwise known as European cherry, English cherry sometimes. It's quite similar in a lot of ways, maybe slightly softer. It's also got more of a greeny yellow undertone to it compared to American black cherry, which is more of a pink color. But as is the case with English walnut, when you move on to boards like this of English cherry, they're very rarely grown sort of for lumber use, and so a lot of the time you're actually working with salvaged wood that can be quite wild in terms of its grain, not necessarily straight, and yeah, just can be quite twisted and distorted, which is a commonality across a lot of fruit woods. In fact, in terms of elasticity, it can actually be quite weak. It does bend under load, and in terms of rupture, I've particularly found this to be the case when working with it. Cherry can split somewhat easily. In fact, what I've heard sometimes is in the arborist trade, where they're cutting down these trees, it's sometimes referred to as the widowmaker, because cherry trees can store so much tension that when they're cut down, they can just blow up. So that means that when you're making things from cherry and you're cutting joinery into it, you need to make sure that joinery isn't too snug, because if it goes together and you've got some sort of wedging action, this will split. So you've got to be careful with that. This video is sponsored by EcoFlow and their Stream Series solar plant. Ever since the van build, yes, it's still ongoing, we've been interested in solar power. So when EcoFlow came along and said they have a new solar panel system, we just had to jump on it, especially as we could install most of the kit ourselves. So using the Stream Basic system, we're mounting 4 times 450 watt solar panels onto Rob's roof, alongside 2 battery banks to store the power. Now, most of that system alone is going to provide a chunk of solar power, but the great thing about the Stream series is that it's scalable, meaning that in the future, we could expand the setup to include enough battery banks to house 11.52 2 kilowatts of energy, while outputting up to 2,300 watts of power. To put that into context, that's enough energy to run some of the larger machines in the workshop. It's worth mentioning that you don't have to install the solar panels onto a flat roof. We're just doing that because it's the easiest option for now. But with the various mounting options available, you can install them almost anywhere. Even the battery banks can be stored outdoors, as long as you have a little bit of cover to block the worst of the British weather. Now, because we're in the UK, we can't plug directly into the sockets like you would be able to do in the US or the EU, but a qualified electrician can at least wire the system into the fuse board with just one simple cable. Once connected up, we can turn the system on and let the sun power the property, monitoring everything via the EcoFlow app. Believe it or not, we installed everything within the space of a day, and we couldn't be more impressed with the build quality of the panels and the batteries. Oh, and one more thing. The system comes with a minimum of a 10-year warranty, so if that doesn't prove EcoFlow believes in its products, we don't know what will. Thank you very much to EcoFlow for sponsoring this video. Now, interestingly, if we take a closer look at this sweet cherry, and by the way, this can happen with this and black cherry, there's some lines going across the board perpendicular to the grain running down the board. And these lines are called medullary rays. And the best way to describe these things is they are basically nutrient highways that carry nutrients from the bark of the tree through to the center of the tree and vice versa. Now, medullary rays are more prominent in some woods more than others. For example, with oak, if you get a perfectly quarter-sawn board, the face is littered with them. I actually find it quite distracting. I've got a board that I'll show you later on that I believe is the perfectly oriented slice of oak, I should say, that has a nice balance between the two, but we'll nerd out on that later. But for now, this cherry is showing signs of medullary rays because the growth rings are running perpendicular to this face. And in the case of cherry, this gives you a really nice kind of ribbon pattern that I think looks quite nice. It gives the face this somewhat silky, sometimes 3D effect. And yeah, I think it's pretty cool. So that's what medullary rays are as it relates to cherry. And, you know, as I said, we'll touch on oak a little bit later because I do have a really nice sample to show you. And oak is renowned for its medullary rays, so it'd be rude not to talk about it. But if you like that kind of silky effect that you get from cherry, but you don't actually want to use cherry, for example, maybe you want something a little bit lighter, there is a wood that I think is so underrated, if not unknown, and is pretty cheap actually compared to a lot of the boards that we see here today, and at least in the UK is actually fairly abundant. And that's this, which is called London Plane. In terms of its janker hardness, elasticity, rupture, and compression strength, it's pretty average across the board. But when it comes to London Plane, the main reason you want to use it is for the beautiful lacewood pattern you get on the face when you either perfectly quarter saw it or if you're just slightly off at an angle. I've got a board here where the growth rings are approaching the face at about a 10-degree angle, and so you end up with this very tight lacewood style pattern on it. But as you'll see here, if I slice the face of this off on a bandsaw so that the face is slightly more parallel to the medullary rays, you'll see that those ray flecks just become more and more prominent. And I've actually got a piece here that shows this off really nicely. We've got a face on the front here that's, you know, it's got quite a nice lacewood pattern on it, but as soon as it slopes off the edge here and we get some more of the quarter sawn face, it is just mind-blowing. Now, when I was doing some research for this wood, apparently it's not very commercially available generally, and I assume most of that data is sourced from the States, because in the UK every sawmill I go to has this stuff and it's usually pretty affordable. And so if you're visiting a sawmill in the UK, go and find some and just grab yourself a little bit like this and make a box from it or something. I'm actually making a keepsake box from this at the moment for some courses that we're currently running, and it just looks amazing. So I really like this stuff and it's really underrated. It does come with a few drawbacks, however. Sometimes you do get some staining throughout the boards. There's actually a tiny bit on here, which is sort of a blacky green color, and that can sometimes be spread throughout the boards. And also when you work it with chisels, particularly along the end grain, it can sometimes crumble a little bit. It doesn't cut quite as cleanly as other woods. The only other drawback of London Plane is the amount of baggage it has surrounding its name. Now, I should be clear here that London Plane is actually a combination of two different species. I don't know how they did this, but they did. You've got American Sycamore and Oriental Plane. Those two somehow had a love child, which is this. Now, in the US, American Sycamore looks pretty much identical to this. I don't know about the working properties of American Sycamore, but the truth is that American Sycamore is actually a plane tree. The reason it's called a sycamore is because when colonists went there and they were looking around, they looked at the tree and think, that's got these leaves on it, that's a sycamore. But it turns out that sycamore is actually a catch-all term for leaves of a certain shape. It doesn't actually explain what the species of the tree is as such. So if you want a tree that looks like this and you're in the States, you probably want to be looking for American sycamore. But know that when you're buying that, you're actually using a plane tree. And in true British fashion, I would love to double down on this and take the piss of Americans for using the wrong name for a tree. But if I'm completely honest, us people on the other side of the Atlantic, I was going to say Europeans then, but Brexit, never mind. We actually did the same thing, because I've got a board over here called Sycamore, or European Sycamore, which is actually a maple tree. Yep, we got it wrong as well. And once again, kind of simplifying here, but it just comes from the fact people saw the tree, it had the leaf and bark attributes of a sycamore in a very similar way to this, so we started calling it a sycamore too. But actually, as far as taxonomy is concerned, it's a maple. This one, however, is significantly softer than the hard maple that I will show shortly, which is the one that you see littered all throughout YouTube, but we'll cover that in a minute. Let's just talk a little bit about European Sycamore. Can't believe, just call it what it is. As far as strength is concerned, Sycamore is weak to average across the board. It can be quite flexible, it can split under tension relatively easy, and it can be compressed with not a whole lot of force compared to some of these other woods. But as you'll see just from a visual basis, I mean, it's completely overexposing my camera at the moment. It's so nice and light, and if you're looking for a pale wood to really contrast against some darker woods, this is one to seriously consider. And we shouldn't always default to maple, which I've got right here, which has got more of a kind of yellowy undertone to it. A lot of people go for maple because of how light it is, but if you want lightness, go for this. And actually, in terms of weight as well, if you're making a piece of furniture that you know is going to have to be moved regularly, then maple is really damn heavy, whereas this could be a nice lightweight alternative that actually gives you even more lightness in terms of colour than you'd get from maple. Additionally, boards of sycamore can be very highly figured. Unlike maple, which we generally refer to as curly or quilted maple, when the exact same effect happens to sycamore, we tend to call it something a little bit more poncy. We call it rippled sycamore, or sometimes even fiddleback sycamore. And it's because that figure on that wood is prized for musical instruments, such as fiddles, and so they hijacked the name and called it rippled or fiddleback sycamore, instead of just calling it what we refer to basically everything else, which is curly. Although come to think of it, I think we also call ash rippled ash sometimes as well. It just, rippled and curly mean the same thing. Don't get too hung up on it, just look at the wood, decide if you like that or not. The other downside with sycamore is that this board is not representative of what boards of sycamore often look like. In fact, it's quite common to find boards that have brown or even grey staining throughout them. I don't know what it is about this wood, but it can be quite susceptible to it. And so getting nice, straight, clean boards like this can sometimes be difficult, but it is possible. And if you're working with this, you might just need to be working around certain areas of staining if you buy a whole board of it. But in a nutshell, that is your two sycamores. There you go, that's the difference. So we've covered sycamore there. That's obviously a nice light wood. It makes sense to now move on to the other wood that I've just alluded to, which is maple. So most people who have been in the woodworking sphere on YouTube for no less than 10 seconds have probably heard everything there is to hear about maple, because us YouTubers won't shut up about it. In terms of its janker hardness, it's pretty damn strong. It takes about 1,450 pounds of force to bury this ball bearing halfway into the wood. In terms of its elasticity, it's very stiff. In terms of its ability to not rupture under stress, it's very strong. And as far as its crushing strength is concerned, it's also very strong. So in terms of an all-round bulletproof strong wood, maple is a pretty solid option, and it's why it's quite often used for things like flooring, butcher's blocks, musical instruments, and even the flooring in bowling alleys, because obviously you've got a bowling ball being lobbed down there. Well, maybe not lobbed, that speaks a lot to my bowling technique, but for a use case like that, you need something that is resistant to denting, and maple is a great option for that. As I said with the European Sycamore, maple can also include curly figure, quilted figure, and in fact you see this on musical instruments quite a lot. It's quite frankly mind-blowing some of the forms that this wood can be found in. And in addition to all of that greatness, it's also the tree that gives us maple syrup, which, thank you. That said, in terms of the actual grain structure of maple, it's what we call close-grained or close-grained, it's sort of one of the two. And what we mean by that is that the face of it is not very porous, I guess, and the difference between the late wood and the early wood, those are two words given to define basically the stripes that you see in wood. There's not much difference in density when you kind of rub your hand across the face of it. Compare that to something like walnut, which we spoke about earlier, which is what we call open grained. That has more of a rough feel to it, and in fact there's woods like oak and ash that I'll show you later on which are even more open. And so this means that woods that are open grains tend to be susceptible to gathering dust and dirt a lot easier, whereas things like maple, which are very close grained and very consistent across their face, tend to be good for applications where you don't want staining to happen too much. So things like cutting boards, for example, things like workbenches. The only other thing is that when it comes to staining maple, I'm not quite sure what causes this, but it can sometimes be blotchy, and you need to resort to specialist techniques to stain it correctly. I'm not in a position to give the best advice on how to stain maple correctly, because quite frankly, when you see what luthiers are able to do with maple in terms of the colors that they're able to dye it and bring out of the grain, they have got it to a T. And so if you want that sort of information, you want to be asking a luthier for that. So in a nutshell, maple can be summed up as a wood that is light, very hard, very strong, and very close grained. However, if maple is not quite what you're going for, maybe you want something that is slightly more, I don't know, slightly cheaper, maybe with a bit more of a rustic look to it, or just something that, I don't know, maybe you just don't want this. A solid alternative, quite literally, I think that's the second time I've used that pun, is beech. So once again, as is the case with maple, beech can be classed as strong across the board. The only thing is its crushing strength, which apparently is average. But the nice thing about beech is that it's very cheap, it's very tough, and it's pretty widely available. And I would say the general use cases for beech are quite utilitarian, because the timber itself, there's not much excitement about it. It hasn't really got a pronounced grain. It's a very dull beige-ish kind of color, and it's quite commonly used for things like workbenches, butcher's blocks, children's toys. Interestingly, I think that's because of the close grainness of it. It doesn't harbor germs and things. There might even be antimicrobial properties about it. And it's also used for things like tool handles, for example, that are designed to take a beating over time. So as I said, it's quite utilitarian, and if I'm honest, if I were to rebuild this workbench that I'm currently filming this video on, I would probably make it out of beech rather than ash, because the ash that I've used for this workbench has an open grain, which again we will touch on later, and so it tends to get dirty and I need to resand it quite often to just look presentable in videos. If I was a real woodworker, and I wasn't just this YouTube poser, then I probably wouldn't care too much. But for my uses, it makes sense to have a nice clean workbench, and so actually Beech might have been a pretty good option for that, especially because of how cheap it is. But perhaps I'm oversimplifying things slightly when I say that this wood is purely used for utilitarian purposes, because Beech can actually do this interesting thing, which isn't unique to Beech, but it happens quite a lot with Beech, and that is spalting. So what we have here are two boards that I've had for a very, very long time. In fact, one of my earliest projects on YouTube many years ago included the other half of these boards that I used for some door panels on a Krenov cabinet I made. So this is what's called spalted Beech. Spalting refers to the fungal attack that happens to Beech, where you've stopped the fungal attack at just the right time, where it's not been attacked so much to the point where it's just crumbling and rotting away, but it's also been attacked just enough to leave behind these really cool patterns. Interestingly, some of the patterns that you see in spalted Beech, particularly the black lines that you'll see throughout it, are actually two different fungus colonies meeting each other somewhere in the board and then actually building a barrier between them to protect, I don't know if colony is the right word, but the black lines are basically a barrier to stop the two funguses meeting each other. And on the subject of fungal attack on Beech, I've somewhat recently got into mycology and trying to grow oyster mushrooms on wood waste. It's a video I've had in the works for a very long time. I'm hoping to get it released soon. But Beech is quite often used as a substrate for growing wood-loving mushrooms, which is quite interesting. One other final detail I sort of forgot to mention earlier. When it comes to identifying Beech, in addition to its relatively plain grain with its light look, an easy way to identify it is through the what's called freckles that appear on the face of the grain. These freckles are actually medullary rays, which is what we saw on the cherry earlier. It's also what we saw on the lacewood, and it's what we're about to see, lovely transition there, on, should have put it at the top of the pile, this board of oak. So this is a board of American white oak, which is probably the most commonly found oak, I might say worldwide, definitely here in the UK, because we just don't have the land mass, or we're not assigning the land mass to start growing our own oak. There are charities that are doing this, such as Woodland Heritage, which we did a video with last year, but obviously we need to wait a while before we're actually self-sufficient in our wood growth here in the UK. So we tend to use American white oak quite a lot, which is a lovely wood. And in my opinion, what we've got here is a perfectly sawn board of quarter sawn oak. Let me explain why. The growth rings on this piece of oak don't quite intersect the face at 90 degrees, meaning that when you actually look at the face, the medullary rays aren't as prominent as a piece of oak that is perfectly quarter sawn. And in my opinion, I sort of much prefer this, because I remember the first time I visited the college where I learned furniture making, and we were being shown around, and one of my tutors pointed out a piece of furniture that another student had made, which was made from quarter sawn oak. And he pointed at these sort of swirly things all throughout it and asked if any of us knew what they were. And I put my hand up and said, machining marks? And this, I think, this is only my experience. I might be completely off the mark with this, but I think this highlights the detachment that us woodworkers sometimes get from the wood that we use in terms of a user's perspective, because someone who isn't into woodwork might not perceive medullary rays with the same beauty that some of us woodworkers have eventually been conditioned to love. Even with things like that lacewood that I showed you earlier, to me that is a beautiful grain. I'm just like, how is wood able to do that? But to other people that's like, what's all this rubbish over it? I just want normal looking wood. I really like the look of this board because the medullary rays are there, but they're not in your face, and actually we still benefit from that lovely straight quarter sawn grain even when the growth rings aren't intersecting the face at 90 degrees. But there you go, that was a little tangent for you there. In terms of strength and data, Oak is once again strong across the board. It hasn't quite got the same janker hardness as maple, which is just a touch higher, but perhaps the main benefit to oak is its durability. This stuff is very resistant to decay, which makes it ideal for outdoor furniture, which is going to be rained on or even in frequent contact with moist soil or something like that. But oak is a lovely wood to work. It planes nicely as long as you're going with the grain, saws really nicely, can be quite tough sometimes, but it still cuts and it doesn't gum up your tools. And in terms of chiseling, you know, it's pretty tough on them, but it's not impossible. One interesting thing that oak does exhibit is the relationship between its elasticity and its ability to rupture. Oak is known as being a wood that can split relatively easily if worked incorrectly, in much the same way that I explained with cherry earlier, where if you assemble a joint that's too tight, it can be susceptible to breaking. Oak can have a similar fate if not worked correctly. And in fact, with oak, it's got a very high modulus of elasticity, which means that it's very stiff. You can use it over long lengths and it probably won't bend. But in terms of its modulus of rupture, so how much pressure it's able to take before it breaks, although it's still quite high, it's not as high as woods like beech, for example. So basically the way this plays out is that if you were to put a pressure on the end of the board here while it's fixed here, although it's not going to bend and flex because of its high modulus of elasticity, it will eventually rupture quicker than woods like beech will. Now there's a lot of variables that come into this, and so you should take a lot of these values with a pinch of salt, because there's factors like grain runoff that obviously come into it. If you've got a growth ring going through a board like this, then that's going to be a weak point and this will snap prematurely compared to a board that has grain running all the way through it. But some of the other interesting things with oak is that it comes in many different forms. In fact, one of my favorite timbers is actually a type of oak, which is called brown oak. Brown oak is just a normal oak tree, but it's been attacked by a specific fungus called, wait for it, the beefsteak fungus, which literally looks like a slab of beef. And I've actually got a tool chest here that I made many years ago, made from the stuff. I mean, just look at that on camera. It's so nice. Compare that with the color of normal white oak here. You can see why this is called brown oak. Granted, this hasn't got a finish on it. It's not going to yellow it as much as this. Brown oak, I think, just has this lovely warm look to it. And interestingly, with this, you can see the medullary rays on the lid. But this is a really interesting example of one of the variations of oak. So if you ever see brown oak, I would highly recommend it. It's beautiful. The other variation we have of oak is we very rarely, very occasionally get what's called bog oak here in the workshop. Bog oak is normal oak that's been buried in a peat bog for many thousands of years, sometimes even older than the pyramids, and has recently been unearthed due to fields being ploughed or just, I don't know, people just occasionally find a board of bog oak. And unfortunately, sometimes they don't realise the value of what they've uncovered. And so there are stories of people uncovering bog oak and then just burning it, not realizing that a log of this stuff is probably their retirement. So bog oak is very expensive. It's very rare because we're obviously not growing it. We just have to rely on people finding it and then not burning it. But when we do get it, we personally go through the process of stabilizing it to make it a lot more structurally sound, and then we turn it into things like this marking knife, which woodworkers can enjoy for many years to come, knowing that they are quite literally holding a piece of history in their hands. If you ever see these on our website, just know that they're in very high demand and very rarely are we able to produce them, so get them while they last. As you'd expect, bog oak also comes in different shades of black. Some of the older ones are almost jet black, whereas some that were buried in more recent millennia tend to be more of a, similar to a brown oak colour actually. And some boards, in fact, you'll actually see this gradient go throughout them. It just looks amazing. In fact, bog oak actually made a public appearance outside of the small sphere of woodworkers that appreciate it when Rochester Cathedral in the UK commissioned this massive table made from bog oak, and it displayed this gradient that I'm talking about. Just looks amazing. I hope to go and see it someday because, whew, very nice. God knows how expensive it was though. And before we move on, one more honorary mention, I really struggle with that word, is red oak. I don't have a board of it here, but red oak is quite commonly seen in the US in your DIY suppliers. It's got more of a pinky undertone to it. I, in the past, have experienced it to be slightly more crumbly and slightly more brittle than normal white oak. And it also doesn't quite have the same durability levels as this oak does as well. But it is a really good option, and I think it can be cheaper in many cases as well. Just know that when you're using it, you're not using the white oak that most people appreciate as being a true oak. Now, oak comes with quite a high price tag, and maybe you want something that isn't quite as heavy as oak as well. I mentioned earlier with maple, if you're making a workbench or a piece of furniture from maple and you need to consider moving it about later on, you're probably going to struggle. Same goes for oak. It's a really, really heavy wood, and if you're going to be moving stuff, you might want to look for something that is a lighter alternative. And if you're looking for that, in my opinion, there's no better option than sweet chestnut. So there are quite a few chestnuts out there. One of the most frequently known ones is horse chestnut, which is the tree that conkers grow on. But this particular one we're focusing on here is sweet chestnut for no particular reason other than the fact it is a brilliant variation of oak, at least in terms of its looks. When we're talking about the strength of this, the janker hardness is significantly lower, the flexibility is higher, the modulus of rupture is, well, weaker, and the crushing strength is also weaker. But if you're just wanting something that looks like oak, but without the weight, and you don't necessarily need the durability of it, this is a solid alternative. I keep saying solid. I need to get off that pun because it's too tempting to cash in on every time. Anyway, the main difference I think you would find in these two timbers is that oak has more of a orangey sort of warmth to it, whereas chestnut has a kind of greeny, yellowy look to it. But as with any wood, there's a lot of variation. You sometimes get oak that looks like this. You sometimes get chestnut that looks like this oak. Chestnut is also a very open grain wood, which is why it looks so similar to oak, just without the similarities in color. So if you like that open grain look, but perhaps you want something more lighter in color compared to chestnut, for me, there is no better than this wood I keep alluding to, ash. Ash is another really interesting wood because I think a lot of us know of ash, but we don't really think to use it all that much because there's other more tempting alternatives like maple, which is a nice light wood. It's obviously very abundant out in the US, and it's very hard wearing as well. And so ash, unfortunately, falls by the wayside a lot. Ash is probably, for me personally, at least in one of my top 5 timbers to work with, because firstly, it smells amazing when you work it. We actually used to train with it back in the college quite a lot, and so I have an element of nostalgia tied to it. In terms of the strength properties of ash, it's actually got some interesting properties about it. Firstly, its janker hardness is pretty high. Not quite as high as the oak and maples that we spoke about earlier, but it's still pretty high. In terms of its elasticity and its ability to not rupture, that's where ash starts to stand out as a little bit of an outlier, because while its elasticity is, well, it's very rigid, it doesn't bend all that much, it does have this element of spring to it, which some people will describe in ash as being shock resistant. That basically means that when you're using it for handles and things, the shock from, let's say it's an axe handle, for example, when you chop the log, that shock doesn't transfer through to your hands and you don't get as much fatigue. And various other things like mallet handles, we actually experimented with ash for a short period of time before eventually moving on to olive wood, which we'll actually talk about shortly. But it's got this element of springiness to it, which means it's very good for tool handles and sports gear as well, such as baseball bats. It's also known for being relatively split resistant, which means if you're using it for practice and you cut a joint to be a little bit too snug, you can be slightly more confident that ash is going to resist being split compared to the likes of oak. And when it comes to looks, ash, much like oak, chestnut, walnut, has an open grain on it, which means that the porous parts of the wood, you can sort of feel them when you drag your fingernail across it. And it does also mean these would be susceptible to getting dirty if you used ash for the wrong scenario. So for me, as I said earlier, this workbench is made from ash. It very frequently gets all sorts of rubbish in those pores, and I have to clean it frequently to make it look presentable in videos. So if you are concerned about that, then maple is going to be a better alternative. This particular piece also has small signs of ripple, because apparently that's what it's called in ash. It's rippled ash, not curly ash. Or maybe it is depending on your region, but here in the UK, for some reason we say rippled ash. On the side here, again, another very interesting point, you can see the rippledness, but we've also got little bits of the grain peeking through, which give it this, what's described as a peanut figure. It looks like peanuts apparently. Now, this isn't as prominent on this board, but there are some species of ash, namely Tamo ash, which I've used very recently in a coffee table, which is a Japanese variant of this tree, but it's quite commonly used to produce veneers. But instead of slicing veneers off the board like this or like this, they actually spin the board and rotary peel it, which just gives it this insane figure that basically gives this throughout the entire board. It's nuts, and I loved using it recently. It's always a crowd pleaser, and again, it speaks to why ash is one of my favourite woods, because, well, I think Tamo ash just carries its reputation for me. I love it. This board also, it's proving to be a great example. On the edge here, we've got some discolouring. Now, in the context of this beautiful, pale, straight-grained piece, this could be seen as a defect. But actually, if you get enough of this defect across a board of ash, it's actually given a different name, which is olive ash. Now, I'm not sure anything happens to an ash tree that turns it this colour. You know, like I mentioned with spalted beech earlier, it's a beech tree that's just had a fungal attack until it turns it into spalted beech. Or with brown oak, it's a normal oak that a fungus has attacked, and so it turns it brown. I don't think that's the case with ash. I think it just occasionally turns this olive colour within the centre of the tree, and then it just becomes a sought after piece of timber from that same log. And so sometimes olive ash can be used as a substitute for olive wood, because they do look very similar, but just know that olive ash is not olive wood. It's just ash that's gone a little bit dark. So we're talking a lot about native timbers at the moment. We've gone through oak, we've gone through chestnut, we've just gone through ash. But if you want something sort of in the middle of them that has that lovely straight fine grain that you'd find in ash, but you want the warmer undertones that something like oak and chestnut gives, in my opinion, there is no better timber for that than elm. Now elm, again, it's one of those timbers like ash that we've all probably heard of, but never really thought to use. But you absolutely should. If you see it in a sawmill, just grab some, make a box from it or something. It's a really nice wood to work with, and it's got a long history of being used in furniture. Now this particular piece, I'm not quite sure what variant of elm I have. I think it's just generic English elm, I think is the name given to it. Many years ago, when I was doing a series called Turning Tuesday, I made a bowl from wych elm, and for the van conversion I'm sort of half doing at the moment and is half dead in the water. I will get back to that eventually, don't worry. The worktop for the kitchen is a solid board of elm, and in fact these pieces will be the drawer sides that I'm going to be using for the drawers within the van. The reason I picked this is because it's a hardwood, but it's also incredibly light. It does have somewhat of a unpleasant aroma when you work with it, kind of. It's still sort of there. It smells very farmy. I don't know. I'm not completely against it, but it is definitely, well, actually, it can be quite stinky. I remember someone turning a bowl from it when I used to work at an Axminster store in the UK, and it stank out the store. It was so bad. All of us staff wanted to throw it out, but the bowl at the end of it was too beautiful. We just felt bad doing it. So yeah, it can be quite stinky, but you can work with it. And also on this board, we can see very, very fine medullary rays because this board has been cut to be perfectly quarter sawn. Once again, it's not as prominent as the things like oak and lacewood, but they are there. So elm is something that I would encourage everyone to try at least once because, you know, it is somewhat abundant. There was a big dieback a few decades ago. Most people have heard of Dutch elm disease, but there are still a number of boards floating around. It is still harvested to this day, just with different species. So grab some of it. I really like it. So as I said, elm is quite a nice middle ground for oak and ash. Elm just sort of sits there in the middle, both in terms of colour and its grain structure. And it also gives somewhat of a rustic look to it as well. But if you're wanting something that's more refined rather than rustic, another lovely segue for you there, mahogany. This particular one I think is Honduran mahogany. I'm not very good at identifying them, but I've just done it on a visual basis based on what I see here. But people identify mahoganies based on the end grain. I think they can also do it based on how it reacts to UV light. There's all sorts of ways, but I'm pretty sure this is Honduran. So mahogany is obviously very well known, and there was a bit of a boom of it being used in the 1800s and the 1900s. Most of that, however, revolved around the use of Cuban mahogany, which was pretty much the American black walnut of that age. That was how it was revered. It was used everywhere, and it also had some lovely working properties to it, apparently. I'm referring to Cuban mahogany in the past tense because unfortunately, it was pretty much harvested to the point of complete depletion, where I was always of the mindset it was completely extinct, but apparently there are still trees dotted here and there, but harvesting them is completely illegal. There are obviously plantations that are there solely to keep the species alive, but they will probably not ever be grown for lumber form. So if you see any freshly harvested, commercially available Cuban mahogany, it's illegal. Probably shouldn't get that, but other ones such as Honduran mahogany doesn't quite have the same working properties as Cuban mahogany as far as I'm aware, because I haven't used it. This Honduran stuff is quite soft as far as janker hardness is concerned. Well, not soft, average. It's about the same as walnut. And then all of its other attributes, such as its flexibility, its ability to resist splitting, and its compression strength are once again average to weak. But this is used in guitar making quite frequently. It's obviously used in furniture these days. I don't personally think it's anything to rave about. It's not really. When it's finished, it gives a very dated look that's not really my thing anymore. And I don't know. If you find some, it's a good price and it's legal. By all means, give it a go. It's obviously got a lovely reputation and everything, but I think the mahogany era is gone, and maybe we'll revisit it at some point, but not for me. But it is very confusing in terms of its names, as is this wood, which is poplar. Now, in terms of strength and everything, compared to all of the other woods that we've covered so far, this is the softest on the janker scale, coming in at around about 540 pounds of force to embed this ball bearing halfway into the wood. So it's nearly 3 times as soft as maple, and so in applications where you're wanting it to resist denting and things, poplar is not for you. But in certain scenarios where you're not worried about that, then this can be a really good timber. One interesting use case for it is for draw sides. There was a woodworking channel I used to watch on YouTube long before I started making videos called Duche and Wolf. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but they used to make beautiful furniture, and I'm pretty sure they used to make draw sides from poplar. It's a very utilitarian approach to making furniture because I think that there's probably woods that maybe slide better than this, given the fact it's so soft, but I'm not one to judge. They definitely know what they're doing. But one of the most common places that poplar tends to be used these days is for furniture that's going to be painted, because poplar has this wonderful, flat, even grain all throughout it that is once again very close-grained, unlike ash and oak, that when you paint over it, you don't actually see any of the growth rings come through. And so it's basically the next best thing to painting a board of MDF. Like, for example, if you're doing kitchen cabinets and you want frame and panel doors, but those are going to be painted, you might not want to make the actual frame around the panel out of MDF, out of fear of it being damaged and potentially exposing the MDF underneath the paint. Instead, you might want to make the frame of the door from poplar, knowing that if it dents, you're just going to see some solid wood underneath that could probably be repaired, and then have the panel in the middle of the door as a paintable MDF. So that tends to be one of the common uses for poplar these days. It's also really good for just practicing cutting joints on because it is so soft, yet it doesn't crumble when you're working it with a chisel. And it's also quite nice to cut with a saw, as well as set your plane up if you're just wanting to figure that out. And it's also pretty damn cheap as well. So if you are just using it for practice purposes, you don't feel quite as guilty using it. But I mentioned about the weird naming of this before. Poplar this is unfortunately where us Brits go wrong. We sometimes refer to it as tulip wood because apparently the tree produces tulip-shaped flowers, and so we looked at that and were like, yeah, tulips, wood, tulip wood. But actually that is rather misleading because there is another wood that I have, which is this Brazilian tulip wood. Now this is an exotic. This is out of the scope of this video because it is not a commonly used wood as far as woodworking is concerned. This is a novelty, it's very rare, it's very expensive. I just got this out because I wanted to speak about the fact that this should be tulip wood and we should stop bloody calling this stuff tulip wood because it is not deserving of the name in the same way that this is. I mean, look, poplar, tulip wood. Let's just settle it there. It does also come occasionally with quite a lot of variation in the grain as far as colour is concerned. There's a variation of poplar called rainbow poplar, which is where you start getting these black, blue, and sometimes red streaks going through the board, which can look pretty cool, and it all comes from the same species of poplar. But one other interesting fact about poplar is it's actually classed as a hardwood. Now, a hardwood is a tree in broad terms that in autumn loses its leaves, otherwise referred to as a deciduous tree. A softwood, on the other hand, is a tree that maintains its leaves all year round. Generally, those leaves are sort of needle-shaped, and these are referred to as coniferous trees. So broadly classing woods as hardwoods and softwoods based on this one being hard and this one being soft is actually misleading, because in a broad sense, that's true, but there are outliers on both sides of that disprove it. For example, poplar is a hardwood, but it's actually really soft. This, on the other hand, yew, is a softwood that's about as hard as maple. In fact, in terms of janker hardness, this yew, a softwood, is the strongest on the list. It takes just over 1,500 pounds of force to bury that ball bearing into this, compared to maple, which sits around 1,450 pounds of force. The same goes for its crushing force, which is again the strongest in the list when you push it end to end, and its modulus of rupture as well, which is how easily it breaks when it's bent, is also pretty high as well. Perhaps the only thing which is average or slightly below average is its elasticity. But this level of elasticity, combined with its ability to resist splitting, is exactly why yew was very commonly used for English longbows back in medieval warfare. Yew trees can also live for thousands of years. In fact, there's some specimens that are found throughout the UK in churchyards that are older than the church itself. However, they were also since planted in graveyards because they were believed to ward off evil spirits. So when you're walking through graveyards, if you see any coniferous trees, high chance it's probably a yew tree, at least in the UK. But anyway, I said this was meant to be a pragmatic guide to woodworking, and here I am talking about evil spirits. When the timber wants to work with you, it can be really nice. For example, when you're planing it, it works beautifully, until you face a bit of reversing grain, and then it tears out like hell. It's a nightmare in that regard. In terms of chiseling, it's obviously very strong, but it does also have this nice softness and consistency to it that makes peeling through it really nice. And in terms of sawing, it's nothing too bad, to be honest. It can be a little bit gummy, but it's nothing that's completely awful. The only thing to really be aware of when it comes to yew, however, is that it's poisonous. There's a high temptation when getting boards of yew to make them into things like chopping boards and serving boards and things, because when you buy them in board form, they have this really nice wild grain about them, and it's very easy to jump to the conclusion that this would make a really nice charcuterie board, but it's poisonous. You shouldn't do that. Realistically, is there enough poison in this to transfer to the food? I don't actually know, so don't quote me on that, but it's poisonous. So you should never make any bowls from this, at least bowls that are going to have food in them. You should never make serving boards from it. And if you are using it and you're creating fine dust, or maybe you're carving it or turning it on the lathe, you should always mask up, because this will fuck you up. So that's yew. It's a softwood, and one final note, it can be quite hard to find in long straight grain sections like this. This is a small section of a wider board that was just completely crazy throughout it. It can be quite difficult to find clean straight grain sections like this that aren't wavy and full of knots, so don't expect to come across that very easily. If you do, buy it, because yeah, it's not very common. One honorary mention in this list is pine, seeing as we're on the topic of softwoods, which interestingly I don't have any in board form here in the workshop at the moment. The word pine is obviously a bit of a catch-all term, but I have worked with a type of pine a number of times over the years called southern yellow pine. The first time I used it was during a tool chest course that I went on with Chris Schwarz, where we made the Anarchist tool chest, and then since then I used southern yellow pine to make my power tool workbench, which is now housed next door. When working it with machine tools, it was quite nice to work with, but hand tools could be very difficult, because what happens is when you're chiseling it, the chisel gets caught up on the harder sections of the grain, which then compress into the softer areas of the grain, which then compress into the harder. You basically just get this domino effect throughout the wood that makes it quite difficult to get a clean cut from. But you know, there's various forms of pine out there, and so I can only really speak to southern yellow pine because that's the only one of that species that I've knowingly used. The rest of them to me are just pine. The other honorary mention is Douglas fir. It's quite commonly used in carpentry purposes, but also when it comes to furniture, you get a really nice simplistic look from it. But again, I don't have a sample from it here. I just wanted to mention them because I know people would ask. The final softwood we're going to talk about, and the final wood in this video, is cedar. Now cedar, once again, massive catch-all term. You've got Western red cedar, you've got cedar of Lebanon, you've got Spanish cedar, which I don't think is actually a cedar tree, now I come to think of it. Maybe it is. There's some sort of weird thing that happens with that, unsurprisingly. But lots of different types of cedar. The one that I think most people will want to use in the context of furniture making is cedar of Lebanon. Cedar of Lebanon is the type of cedar that when you smell it, it gives you that cedar smell that, well, maybe you don't know what it smells like, but when you smell it, you're like, oh, I know that smell. Cedar has a very distinct smell, and not Western, that's the other one. And cedar of Lebanon is the thing that does that. The dining table that I mentioned earlier on in this video that I did the ebonized underframe for had a cedar of Lebanon top. I flattened that entire thing with a router and then sanded it, and the entire workshop just smelt amazing. I also used it very recently for a coffee table in the bottom of the drawer bases, and when I'm making boxes and things, I also put cedar in the bottom to give it a nice aromatic smell when you open the box, and yeah, you just get a good whiff of it. It's also very resistant to decay and bug attack, and also moths don't like the smell of this stuff either, and so you'll quite commonly find wardrobes made of the stuff, or at least the back panel of wardrobes being made of cedar. So then the smell of it basically fills out the wardrobe, and you don't get moths going in and eating holes in all of your clothes. Another project I made cedar from many years ago was a Japanese style picnic bench. The only thing to be conscious of with that is obviously it's a very weak timber, and you need to be careful that you're not putting too much structural trust in the wood when it comes to working with it, because it could potentially snap, overload, and particularly work itself apart over time. So the Japanese picnic bench I made many years ago is still alive out the front of the workshop, but it's a bit racky these days. And to be honest, if I was going to make it again, I would make it out of oak, because that's the most durable wood compared to all of the things that we've spoken about so far. So that is all of the woods that I believe, as a woodworker, you should probably be aware of. I don't think you need to stick to the tried and trusted walnuts and maples and things, because, you know, they are lovely, They obviously work, they give some really nice contrast and things, but there's so many other cool timbers out there, and that is one of the most beautiful things about, I think, this job and this hobby, whatever level of woodworking you do. The fact that we get to work with this natural product that has so much variation in its looks and its properties is such a blessing, and I think that we owe it to ourselves to at least try all of these once. We should be responsible with some of them, such as your mahoganies and some of your exotic woods that we're not going to talk about in this video, but we will talk about in a future one. But on the whole, most of the woods we've talked about today, bar this one, can be used to bring a really nice, unique spin to a lot of your furniture. So I hope you found this video useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.